Hello everyone, welcome once again to Cave Across Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And welcome to our newest book, kind of half book, part of a book that we decided to do, which is Craig Keener's book, Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts.
Yeah, so no actual damage was done to a book during
Right.
this.
Right. We didn't cut it up. We're just putting our finger in the middle of the books that we own and kind of mining out something that we find quite interesting. And this is, of course, a more academic book than probably what people are used to. The price point, if you've checked the links, kind of verify that. And there's no sales on this book. So if you're wanting an academic source on miracles, this is kind of the book to go through. And Craig Keener's also written a more popular level book more recently on miracles that you can find for a cheaper price. But the girth of the volume of that one is much shorter than these two.
Yeah. So this is two books. What we've done is kind of jumped into beginning in, I think, chapter 4, right? And start from there. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here with this one.
Right. And so Craig Keener, doctorate from Duke University and the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary. And he's done a lot of work. This is kind of the volume to go to when you want to talk about miracles, and not just miracles of Old Testament, New Testament, and Acts, but also post-biblical accounts of it, and not just accounts from the Western world, but also from around the world. Kind of the second volume of these two books on miracles delve into that a bit more. And I believe the later part of the first volume as well. But what we want to do is kind of put our finger in the middle and talk about a philosophical concept, especially determining how miracles were talked about before the Enlightenment period, and then also delving deep into the guy who is kind of known as the anti-miracle guy in it. So if you're dealing with miracles, if you're dealing with metaphysics and philosophy classes, you're going to know the name David Hume. And so Keener has a very lengthy discussion in here that we find pretty interesting here on responding to David Hume. But before that, we kind of wanted to back up where he's got this section on miracles and talk about, well, miracles seem to be a primary thing that happens in societies, and currently, although you may discount the types that you have, but we can't deny that they've been a part of our stories for a while. And what does historians of ye old times do with those accounts? Have we always just been accepting of them? Have we always been critical of them? Was it just until David Hume came along that said, wait, did these things actually happen? Do we all of a sudden go, wait, did these things actually happen? And so that's where we want to start out with the discussion on Hume and the philosophical problem of miracles, or the philosophical probability of miracles, depending on which side of the line that you want to do. So we definitely encourage this book. It's a more academic one. I'm also going to link his more kind of popular version of his newer miracles book as well, if you want to check that out. So if the price dissuades you for this one, know that we're just, for now at least, covering kind of some of the middle chapters, but there's a fuller popular version that might not make all of our heads hurt as much with this one. But that's where we're going to take on today, is we're starting in chapter 4, and he is entitled The Antisupernaturalism as an Authenticity Criterion.
Well, that's a mouthful.
Yeah. So against supernaturalism. So the things that are not natural, right?
Right.
And so what does the early period of history look like? And so he starts out here in chapter 4 saying, in both the early Christian period and the modern period, miracle claims have boasted significant detractors. Probably a big thing. You say someone's been raised from the dead, not only do we read about it in the New Testament and seen it as a source of contention, but if you say that today with any of your friends, you might get a few scoffs as well. So usually dead men stay dead. And so when you say something that happens not naturally, you have to provide proof for it. You have to kind of bolster the claim that something not natural has taken place. For much of history, such detractors were sometimes critical of unfounded claims without ruling out the possibility of genuine supernatural activity. Since the argument of David Hume, however, much of the modern academia has a priori ruled out claims of direct supernatural activity in the natural world. Meaning, well, we all know these outlandish claims of miracles and supernatural things occurring, the gods doing one thing, or people rising from the dead, or crops growing within a matter of seconds. These things cannot and don't happen. Therefore, we can just look back at all those stories and just realize everyone's kind of believed a myth, and we can just dismiss them out of hand without much claim. Now let's figure out how Hannibal crossed the Alps with some more elephants. That one is okay to believe, but people turning water to wine cannot happen. So that's what we want to do here.
And so he says, however, because many of the foundations of Hume's argument no longer fit our contemporary philosophic and scientific context, many scholars, he says, have begun to question the Humean paradigm, right? And so, and he's going to do this now in the next chapter, I believe, when we get to it, but we're kind of working our way up to that. So he says many of Hume's contemporaries recognize the circularity of his foundational arguments, even in his own day. And so in the next few chapters, he's going to first introduce discussion about anti-supernatural assumptions as an authentic, to authenticate the criteria in terms of New Testament scholars. In other words, if, the claim would be something like this. If there is a claim of supernatural, then that can't be authentic claim. That's the idea here, right? And so he's going to look at this idea, and that basically comes as a result of Hume's critique. He says, then he'll trace briefly some of Hume's objections to miracles and counter-objections raised against his arguments, and briefly argue that his case Hume's case provides an inadequate basis for a priori ruling out the possibility of supernatural activity. So notice, Hume, in his arguments, as we'll see, kind of suggests he's not really trying to a priori ruling out. He's kind of suggesting that the probability of miracles are so small that they, aren't credible. But what Keener here is suggesting here is that based on Hume's arguments, now we have, even before you examine the evidence, you rule out the possibility of a miracle. That's a priori ruling out the possibility of supernatural activity. Right. And he's going to suggest, as historians, do we really want to go there? That's more not history, but philosophy, and it's based on a particular worldview, right? Mm-hmm. And right. So that's what he's going to question here. And part of as we go along. He won't get to all of that in this particular section, but we'll see he'll begin to question that as we go.
Right. So we're going to look before the time of Hume, during the time of Hume, and even a little bit after the time of Hume as well. So it turned out to be quite an interesting chapter here. Well, this chapter provides a historical prolegomena for the next two chapters, which questions the dogmatic anti-supernaturalism that most modern academia has inherited from Hume and others. So just be skeptical of all these claims. Don't worry about it. It might have fed into the society at the times, but we know that it couldn't have happened. Therefore, we can just dismiss them out of hand, and they can just fade into the background of hobbits and wizards and dragons, because we know those things don't also exist. All except for the dragons there. Well, it is in those chapters that he'll address in greater details the anti-miraculous approach that developed in the radical Enlightenment. And it's always nice to see people kind of poo-poo the Enlightenment a bit more these days. So I'm excited for that as well. But here he'll survey instead especially some classical standards of thought on which some Enlightenment thinkers drew. And then he'll join other voices in emphasizing that we have frequently embraced anti-supernaturalism as simply an automatic, unexamined assumption, and will note that it, too, reflects a specific cultural setting, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, good. And he says, while granting that most ancient historians included at least some claims of paranoia occurrences that they attributed to deities or intermediate beings, most critics often use supernatural elements as a criterion for distinguishing what is genuinely history in ancient histories from what is not. And so that's the idea of this authenticity criterion that he's looking at, right? Anti-supernaturalism as an authenticity criterion. In other words, since I don't believe in the supernatural, then I can use that belief to determine whether or not a particular historical account is authentic or not. That's what he's getting at.
Right.
So he says, in both the Gospels and Acts, a major presupposition in the exclusion of reported events as non-historical has been the content criteria that generally supernatural activities doesn't happen, right? So here's an activity, here's something described in the book of Acts, the Gospels. Was it supernatural? Yes. Then it probably didn't happen, right? That's it. So it's using the anti-supernaturalism as to determine whether or not something is authentically credible.
Right.
He says, we shall see in the next two chapters, however, that this expectation proves unfounded because of weaknesses in the anti-miracle argument. In fact, the possibility of miracles remains a live issue in the philosophy of religion today. All right, so that's where he's headed here.
All right, so he's going to talk about ancient skepticism towards miracles. But to me, it seems like all these the smart people times, they just accepted everything and drew in, and they talked about the gods and doing outlandish things. And all these people had miracles attributed to them. You know, the cross in the sky, in my symbol, in the symbol, conquer, you know, the Charlemagne type deals and you know, the popes claiming all these things. So we just go back further, and those claims just get more abundant, and everyone believed those things, right? Apollo takes his chariot across the sky, and that's what brings the sun in. Ra, the sun god, he's the one that controls it, and for Egyptians, and just everyone has this belief from it. Well, actually, that doesn't seem to be the case. So we need to have a correct understanding of our ideas of not only history, but also what those historians, those ancient historians, allowed in or brought in. And boy, if only they wrote and we have those things today, maybe we could survey those things. Good for us that we've realized that parchment and vellum can transfer ink, and we have some of those today. All right, so some ancient writers shared modern critics' concerns about undue interest in the paranormal, though not typically for exactly the same radical Enlightenment reasons, he says. One writer whose critique of traditional monotheistic religions sounds almost modern is the late 2nd century physician Galen. He denounced, among the other contemporary positions, the view of Moses, according to which God is not bound by the orderly process of nature. Galen preferred the rational choices of the God of nature, the true evidence of providence, to the irrational ideas of a deity working contrary to the normal courses of nature, right? So that's why we know miracles can't happen, because God has to suspend nature. You know, that's always seems to be the claim of why the miracles can't happen. And we have to lovingly correct, no, it's not a suspension of nature. It's just continuing to work out in nature. It's a force, a being, a mind acting in nature. It's not a suspension of nature.
Yeah. So what he's noting here is that Galen was skeptical about miracles. So we can't go back and say all of these people believed everything, and they, no. There were some that were skeptical. Now, notice he makes the point, he says, nevertheless, most writers in late antiquity, including Christian writers, applied the phrase contrary to nature that Galen here was dealing with only to people contravening moral law or the norms of reason established by nature, but they didn't apply it to miracles. So he's suggesting that when they talked about it back here, contrary to nature, they were talking about people acting contrary to the laws of nature with regard to morality and reason, and not the physical laws, right? So that's a point that's kind of interesting here that he makes. He says, lacking sufficient knowledge of empirical science, some ancient writers came up with naturalistic alternatives for explaining natural phenomena that differed from traditional religious explanations, the way that they offered. And most of the, even the polytheistic contemporaries. So these folks didn't really have empirical science down like we do, but, they did come up with what what we could look back on and say maybe they were attempting naturalistic explanations to some of these things. Mm-hmm. So again, he's highlighting that not all ancient historians and writers accepted everything that they were told with regard to these miraculous events.
Right.
And so he says, for example, while some viewed the winds, right, so the wind, as divine, and others presented them as under divine or angelic authority, still others viewed them as purely natural phenomena. So the wind blows, is that, some divine God doing it or angelic being doing it? Or is it some type of natural phenomenon? Well, some viewed it as just a natural phenomenon, right? And so he says the guesses obviously were not all equally correct, but they were authentic attempts at purely and largely naturalistic explanations. So again, his point that he's trying to drive home is that there was some skepticism even back with regard to ancient historians.
Right. So if you have things like Odyssey and, Odysseus angers the god by not giving thanks before he goes, he's blown off course and that's unnatural to him. So there is a divine wind, but also there is just the normal course of wind occurring. And we see that in Acts right before Paul gets stranded on Malta, is they want to make for a certain port because that's the normal course of events. So it's not always, every time a small gust of wind blows, that's God guiding it through the ether of his direct involvement. But there seems to be then a exchange sometimes for when unnatural things. And so there we have to clarify our terms with unnatural as quote mining, like church fathers always seems to get us in trouble, is if we type into something and grab a quote from Google without reading the full context of the quote from church fathers, sometimes we or our interlocutors can get in trouble that way. All right, so yet skepticism applied not only to supernatural interpretations of what we would readily describe as natural phenomena today, but it often applied to claims of paranormal phenomenon. So it doesn't seem like everyone's just accepting everything that comes in. Such skepticism appears both among characters in fiction and historical writings. Ovid makes some of his characters more believable by having them doubt the supernatural, while others affirm that deities can do anything before they are all changed into bats for disbelieving in Bacchus, which, the wine god tends to do that.
Yeah. So he said Lucian approves of a historian reporting potential myths, so long as one does not affirm them, but leaves their veracity to the audience to decide, right? So, yes, you can report on potential myths, but you're just reporting.
Right.
And whether or not they're true, their veracity, you kind of leave that up to the audience. That's what Lucian was advocating here. Yeah, the most thoroughgoing critique of including paranormal events in history, however, he says, comes from the critical historian Polybius.
Yeah, so Polybius's critique of sensationalist historians. So he's critiquing these historians who seem to be going over and above to tell a good story. But he's the Joe Friday of the time. He just wants just the facts, ma'am. So that's what he's doing. I'm sorry, that's a Dragnet reference. Probably no one's alive these days in our audience to understand a Dragnet reference. It was a great show. All right, so Polybius complained about historians who focus too much on prodigies and use tragic coloring. Some reports of signs do serve such functions, but again, Luke and other gospel writers focus on miracles because they tell about a miracle worker, not because they resemble the sensationalist works Polybius critiques, which typically contain elaborate scenes of pathos, of a thing to the end. It's not so much that Jesus fed the 3,000, the 5,000, but he does it for a particular purpose. And the fact that mentioning, 12 baskets being left over seems to be an important point of the story where, yes, he does all these healings and miracles, but what are they for? They're for a completion of a prophetic fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy that the Son of Man would come to do such miracles.
Right. So what we've seen so far here, and that he's presented at the beginning of this chapter, is the idea that not all ancient historians accepted all events as with veracity. Some of them were skeptical of these various miracle claims, and they, while they had different criteria for Enlightenment folks during and after the Enlightenment, there were still some that were skeptical and critical with regard to these miraculous claims. So did we want to end it here and then move on to more specific kinds of issues as he moves on with this chapter?
Yeah, so this was a good intro to kind of set the scene of what's going to happen, kind of what we plan to cover, and also what this chapter is going to cover, which is that, the ancient peoples did seem to have a documentation scheme of telling these stories that involve these supernatural claims, but not everyone seems to hold that just because they wrote them down doesn't mean that they happen, or that people could make determinations based on the reasons for telling those types of stories, which is interesting. So we're going to pause here kind of in the middle of chapter 4 and give you some time to recollect your a priori assumptions and see if you need to reevaluate them from the Enlightenment period themselves. So hopefully this is interesting to you as we soldier on to attack Hume and his outdated assumptions. And so that'll be fun to do. So thanks for joining us. And of course, you can check out all the short clips and everything that we tend to do on YouTube and Rumble and caveofthecross.com for all the books that we've done in the middle of the page. And then, of course, the book reviews that you were completely inundated with, if you follow us on social media of mine, are up there. And you can check all those out as well. And as always, we say thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.